Niles Calder arrived 20 minutes early. He had parked on the street rather than the small lot behind Philip Ware's office, which meant he had walked past the front of the house, Dorothy's house, the white clapboard on Monticello Road, with the Blue Ridge visible above the tree line on his way in. He had not stopped to look at it. He had looked at his phone. Philip Ware's office was in a converted Victorian on Main Street that had been a law office for 40 years, with the particular quality of rooms where serious things had been happening long enough that the serious things had become part of the atmosphere. He came in and sat down across from the desk and placed his phone face up on his knee and waited. Janet arrived 7 minutes later. She had driven from Charlotte the previous evening and had the particular composure of someone who has been preparing for a meeting they expect to be straightforward. She sat beside Niles. She did not look at the phone in her hand, but she kept it in her hand. Philip Ware came in at 9 exactly. He was 60 years old and had been practicing estate law in Buncombe County for 32 years, and he moved through these proceedings with the economy of a man who understood that his job was to convey information accurately and allow it to do what it was going to do. He sat down, he opened the folder. He read the will. Dorothy Calder's personal effects, her books, her jewelry, the small items of a life lived carefully to be divided between Niles and Janet according to their preferences, with any disputes to be resolved by the executor. The savings account modest, divided equally. The furniture, the household contents, the ordinary distribution of an ordinary estate. Niles nodded at each item. He had the look of a man moving through a checklist. Then Philip Ware placed a second document on the table. He said, and this is the beneficiary deed that Dorothy filed with the Buncombe County Register of Deeds on March 7th. Niles looked at the document. He said, what property does the deed transfer? Philip Ware said the house on Monticello Road, and the barn behind it. Niles said, to whom? Philip Ware read the name. Niles looked up from the document. He said, who is Frances Aldridge? Janet lowered her phone for the first time since she had sat down. In the corner of the room, B. Sutton, 69 years old, Dorothy's neighbor for 20 years, the person Philip Ware had called the previous week because Dorothy had asked him to have her present, sat with her hands folded and said nothing. She had known the answer to Niles's question for 3 years since the afternoon Dorothy had called her over for tea and said, B, I want to tell you why I'm doing this. Not because I need your approval, because I want someone to understand. She understood. She had understood since before Dorothy told her, since the years of watching a light go on in the barn every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon and watching it go off 2 hours later, and knowing in the way you know things when you have lived next to someone for 20 years that what was happening in that barn was something real. Frances Aldridge was not in Philip Ware's office that morning. She was at the barn. It was Tuesday. She had been coming on Tuesdays and Thursdays for 8 years, had come the Tuesday after Dorothy's funeral because the barn needed tending and because she did not know what to do with herself in the absence of the thing she had been doing, and the barn was where she knew how to be. She was shelving books, returning things to their places, running her hand along the catalog she and Dorothy had built together over 8 years, 6 notebooks of their combined handwriting, 4,000 entries for 4,000 books that 2 women had read and argued about and marked with their thoughts in the margins and on post-it notes and in the small, careful notations of people who believed that a book was not read until someone had written in it. She did not know her name had just been read aloud in an office 3 blocks away. She did not know that Niles Calder was looking at a piece of paper that changed everything. She was shelving books. That was what she did on Tuesdays. That was what Dorothy had watched her do for 8 years. That was in the end exactly why. The will reading took 11 minutes. Philip Ware read it in the way he read all documents that required precision without editorializing, without the pauses that some attorneys used to give weight to certain items over others, at the pace of someone who understood that his job was to deliver information and allow the people in the room to receive it in their own way. Niles had a legal pad on his knee. He was not taking notes. He was using the pad as a surface to tap his pen against at intervals, a habit Philip had observed in men who were accustomed to meetings and were processing them in real time. He nodded at each item, the books, the jewelry, the household contents, the savings account, the equal division between himself and Janet, Nodded, moving through it. Janet had her phone in her lap, face up, which she glanced at twice during the reading. She had the composed expression of someone who had prepared for this meeting by deciding in advance how she would feel about its contents, and was now confirming that her preparation had been accurate. Then Philip placed the second document on the table. He set it beside the will rather than on top of it, a specific placement, the placement of something that was separate from and not subordinate to the first thing. He said Dorothy also executed a beneficiary deed which she filed with the Buncombe County Register of Deeds on March 7th of this year. Niles looked at the document. His pen stopped tapping. He said, "What property does this transfer?" Philip said the residence at Monticello Road. "And the barn structure behind it?" A pause. Niles said, "To whom?" Philip said to Frances Aldridge. The name sat in the room the way certain names sit in rooms when they are unexpected, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the specific weight of something that has arrived and is now simply present and must be dealt with. Niles looked at the document. He looked up. He said, "Who is Frances Aldridge?" Janet lowered her phone. It was the first time since she had sat down that the phone was not at least peripherally attended to, the first time she had fully arrived in the room. She looked at Philip with the expression of a woman who has encountered something that does not fit the model she brought into the meeting and is recalibrating. "She said my mother couldn't have decided this on her own." Philip looked at her. He said, "Mrs. Caldervogt, your mother did everything on her own." He said it without sharpness, as a plain statement of the fact he had observed over the 3 years during which Dorothy Calder had come to his office to arrange this deed, had returned for the neuropsychological evaluation she had scheduled, independently, had reviewed the completed documents twice before signing, and had filed the deed herself at the county register. Niles had his phone to his ear. He had called someone his own attorney Philip understood, which was predictable and entirely within his rights. He stood up and moved to the far corner of the room, speaking in the low, urgent register of a man who needs to consult quickly and does not want the other parties to hear the consultation. Janet was looking at the deed. She read it with the attention of someone looking for the error, the procedural flaw, the detail that would explain why this document was not what it appeared to be. Her expression as she read was the expression of a person who does not find the error and is not yet ready to accept that there is no error to find. Bea Sutton in her corner chair watched all of this. She had been watching Niles and Janet since they came in, watching with the specific attention of a woman who has known their mother for 20 years and is now seeing them in this moment with the clarity that sometimes comes when a person is placed in the context of what they have been absent from. Niles's legal pad, Janet's phone, the 11 minutes it had taken to hear their mother's will, which had included a lifetime of accumulated objects, and was now completed and filed and already being moved past. She said nothing. She was not here to say things. She was here because Dorothy had asked her to be here, and Dorothy had been specific about the reason not to testify, not to intervene, just to be present, just to be the person in the room who understood. Philip looked at his watch. It was 9:10. He had called Frances Aldridge that morning at 8, had reached her on the second ring, her voice carrying the particular quality of someone who had already been up for hours and was in the middle of something. He had asked if she could come to his office at 3 o'clock. She had said yes and asked if everything was all right. He had said that Dorothy had left some matters to be addressed and that he wanted to go through them with her in person. She had not pushed for more information. She had said she would be there at 3. He had not told her about the deed. Dorothy had asked him not to, had said specifically let her find out in the room, the way Niles and Janet will find out in the room. I don't want her to have time to be afraid of it before she knows what it is. He had honored the instruction. Frances was in the barn when her phone rang. She had been there since 1 o'clock, the Tuesday hours she had been keeping for 8 years, the hours she had kept the Tuesday after Dorothy's funeral, because she had not known what else to do with herself, and the barn had been where she knew how to be. She had been reshelving the books she and Dorothy had pulled for a thematic reading list they had been working on in November, the last project, the one left unfinished, returning each one to its catalog place, with the small specific attention of someone who knows where everything belongs because she helped put it there. The phone was in her jacket pocket. She had been reaching for the last book on the cart, a slim paperback one of Dorothy's marked-up copies, the kind with the post-it notes still on the pages from the last time it had been read when the phone buzzed. Philip Ware. She set the book on the cart rather than the shelf where she had been about to place it and walked to the barn door. The afternoon light was coming in at the angle it came in at this time of year, low warm, the specific light of a North Carolina late afternoon in autumn, the Blue Ridge visible above the tree line, the mountains going their particular purple gray as the day aged. She answered. "Philip," said Frances. "Thank you for picking up. I wanted to confirm our 3 o'clock. She said I'll be there." She ended the call. She stood in the barn doorway for a moment, the afternoon light on her back, the shelves behind her in their familiar order, the cart with the unfinished reshelving beside the window. She went back inside. She picked up the book she had set on the cart. She found its place on the shelf and slid it in. She did not know that 3 blocks away in an office on Main Street, a man she had never met was holding a piece of paper with her name on it and asking who she was. She was shelving books. It was Tuesday. That was what she did. The call came at 8:15 in the morning. Frances was in the front garden, the small bed Dorothy had planted along the porch steps years ago, and that Frances had been tending since Dorothy's health made kneeling difficult. She was watering the late-season asters, the ones that bloomed into November in the North Carolina mountains, and her phone was in her jacket pocket, and she answered it without looking at who was calling because she had been expecting Philip to check in. He said, "Frances, I need to tell you something before you hear it from another source. Niles and Janet filed this morning. Buncombe County Superior Court." She stood with the watering can in her hand. She said, "What are they asking for?" He said, "They're requesting the deed be declared void." She set the watering can on the porch steps. She sat down on the top step. 58 pages. Philip read her the key sections over the phone, which he did because he believed that the actual language mattered, and that summarizing it was a form of protection she had not asked for and did not need. He read the claims as written in the specific flat language of legal filings that managed to say difficult things in the most procedurally neutral possible terms. 2 primary claims. The first, undue influence. The filing alleged that Frances Aldridge had systematically cultivated a position of trust and dependency with Dorothy Calder during the final years of Dorothy's life, exploiting Dorothy's increasing social isolation and diminished critical judgment to manipulate her into executing a property transfer that she would not have made under normal circumstances. The second, lack of capacity. The filing cited Dorothy's medical records from the final 2 years of her life, specifically a physician's notation about age-related cognitive changes, and argued that Dorothy had not possessed the legal capacity to execute a valid property deed at the time of signing. The third category, a personal statement from Niles Calder describing the pattern of Frances's presence in Dorothy's life as controlling and opportunistic. Philip read the relevant sentence. Frances Aldridge exploited the loneliness and naive trust of a vulnerable elderly woman. Frances was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Philip, naive isn't the word I would use for Dorothy." She said it without heat. As a simple correction of the record, the specific response of a person who knew the subject of the description and found the description inaccurate. Philip said, "No, it isn't." She drove to the barn after the call. She did not go immediately. She sat on the porch steps for a while, after hanging up looking at the asters she had been watering, and at the front walk, and at the Blue Ridge visible above the tree line at the end of the street. She sat with the information, the way she sat with difficult things, which was to give them the space they required, before deciding what to do with them. Then she went inside for her bag, and drove the 2 blocks to the barn. She unlocked the door and went in. The barn in the morning light was different from the barn in the afternoon light. The morning came in lower through the east window and fell on the east-facing shelves in a way that showed the spines of the books in a different quality of illumination. She had noticed this in the first year of coming here and had never stopped noticing it. Dorothy had said once that the books looked different in different light because they were different objects, depending on when you looked at them, which was also true of the people who had written them. She did not shelve anything. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at the 6 notebooks of the catalog on the small desk in the corner, at the 2 chairs by the window, at the 4,000 books in their organized sequence, at the post-it notes still visible on some of the spines. 58 pages of a legal filing called All of This Exploitation. Called Dorothy naive. She picked up the catalog, the first notebook, the one from the early years when Dorothy's handwriting and hers had been finding their rhythm together when they were still figuring out the system. She opened it to a random page. Dorothy's entries in blue ink, her own in black, the 2 hands alternating down the page in the specific way of 2 people who have been doing the same work together long enough that the work itself has become a form of conversation. She closed it. She put it back. That evening she sat in her chair. The 2 chairs by the window had been their arrangement from the first year, Frances on the left, Dorothy on the right, which had been Dorothy's side, because the right window had the better angle for reading in the late afternoon. Frances had taken the left chair from the beginning and had never sat in the right one. She did not sit in it now. Dorothy's chair was exactly as it had been on the last Thursday. Frances had been here with her, the small wool blanket Dorothy kept folded over the arm. For the cold afternoons, the reading light adjusted to the angle Dorothy preferred, the side table with the coaster Frances had given her 2 Christmases ago. She had not moved any of it. She sat in her own chair and looked at Dorothy's and let the barn be quiet around her. Her phone rang. B. Sutton. She answered. B. said, "Frances, does Niles even know what the inside of that barn looks like?" Frances thought about this. She said, "I don't know. I've never seen him in there." B. said, "In 20 years of living next door to Dorothy, I saw that man in the barn twice. Both times he stood in the doorway. He didn't go in." Frances looked at the shelves. 4,000 books, 6 notebooks, 8 years of Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. She said Dorothy knew that. B. said Dorothy kept track of everything, Frances. You know that better than anyone. She did know that. Dorothy had kept track of everything, the catalog, the reading dates, the annotations, the small, careful record of who had been here and when and what they had been doing. She had built the system from the beginning, had insisted on the handwritten notes rather than a digital catalog because she said that handwriting told you something that a spreadsheet couldn't. She had been right about that. The catalog was evidence of exactly what it said. It was 8 years of 2 people's presence recorded in their own hands in the specific detail of people who believed that attention was a form of love. Niles had called that exploitation. Dorothy had called it Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. Frances looked at the window. The Blue Ridge was dark now, just the shape of the mountains against the lighter dark of the sky. She said, "Philip said we have 3 weeks before the first hearing." He said, "Then we have 3 weeks." Frances said good night and set the phone on the side table and sat in her chair in the barn that a retired librarian had spent 15 years building and that a legal filing had just called a site of manipulation. And she let herself feel the full weight of what it meant to have someone look at the most real thing in your life and describe it in that language. Then she turned on the reading light. She opened a book. That was what Dorothy would have done. B's kitchen was the kitchen of a woman who had been making tea seriously for 60 years. The good teapot, the cups that matched the particular order of a space that had been arranged by habit into exactly what it needed to be. She had called Frances the previous evening and said, "Come before you go to Philip's. There's something Dorothy asked me to tell you when the time came. The time is now." Frances came at 8. They sat at the kitchen table with their tea, and the window that looked out over the shared fence line between B's yard and Dorothy's yard, the Blue Ridge visible above the roof line in the clear November morning. Frances had her hands around her cup. B had hers around hers. They sat for a moment in the comfortable silence of 2 women who had known each other long enough not to require preamble. Then B said, 3 years ago, Dorothy came over on a Wednesday afternoon. Not a Tuesday or Thursday, those were your days. Wednesday was for me sometimes. She brought the good shortbread, which meant she had something to say. She looked at her tea. She said she sat where you're sitting, and she said, "B, I'm going to do something that Niles and Janet won't understand. I need someone to know the real reason. Not the legal reason Philip has that, "The real reason," Frances said. "What did she tell you?" Bea told it in the order Dorothy had told it, which was the order of observation, rather than the order of argument, not building toward a conclusion, but simply laying out what had been seen, the way a person who has been paying attention for a long time lays out what they have noticed. Dorothy had told her about Niles first. He had come for Christmas the previous year, his first visit in 4 years, which Dorothy had noted without complaint, but had noted. He had stayed one night. He had walked through the house with the particular quality of attention that Dorothy described as inventory, not hostile, not calculating in any dramatic way, but the attention of a man who was registering what things were and what they might be worth. He had asked at dinner about property values in Asheville. He had asked about the barn. He had not gone into the barn. He had stood in the doorway and looked in and nodded in the way of someone confirming an impression, and then come back to the house for dinner. Dorothy had watched this. She had noted the doorway, the look, the return to the house. Then Bea told her about Janet. Janet called every Sunday at 2 o'clock. This was consistent, had been consistent for years, and Dorothy appreciated the consistency in the way she appreciated all forms of reliability. But the calls were 8 minutes 9 on a good week. The content was the same every week. "How are you feeling? Do you need anything? Is there anything I can help with from Charlotte?" Dorothy had answered honestly each time, and each time the call had moved on and concluded. She had told Bea Janet loves me the way a good daughter loves her mother from a distance. She calls on Sunday. She asks the right questions. She doesn't need to know the answers to feel that she is asked. Then Bea told her about Frances. She said Dorothy told me she had been watching Frances for 8 years before she did anything. She said she didn't want to act on sentiment. She wanted to be sure. She said, "Dorothy told me," and I want to get this right because she was careful about how she said it. She said, "Frances comes on Tuesday and Thursday. She doesn't call ahead, she just comes. She opens the barn. She does the work. She makes tea for both of us. 8 years, not a single week missed. Not because I asked her to come, because she wants to." She looked at Frances. She said Dorothy said Bea Niles and Janet love me the way children love a mother from a distance on schedule, just enough to not feel guilty. Frances loves me differently. She's here, and she doesn't need to be asked. "Oh!" Frances held her teacup. She was looking at the window at Dorothy's yard, visible through Bea's kitchen window, the porch steps, the path to the barn. "She said I didn't know she was watching." And Bea said she wasn't watching in the way of someone keeping score. She was watching the way she cataloged books, noticing things and writing down what she noticed and trusting what the record showed her. Frances thought about the catalog, the 6 notebooks, the 4,000 entries in their 2 handwritings, the record of 8 years of Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. Bea said, "She told me one more thing. I want to make sure I say it right." She set her cup down. She said, "Dorothy said I don't need anyone to love my barn. I only need someone who understands why I love it." Frances is the only person I've never had to explain that to. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the Blue Ridge was doing what it did in November, going its particular shade of blue-gray in the morning light, the mountains patient and permanent above the tree line. Philip's office was at 10. He went through the legal situation with the specific clarity he brought to difficult information, the timeline, the deed, the neuropsychological evaluation Dorothy had arranged independently 4 weeks before the signing. He explained what Niles and Janet's filing would need to demonstrate and why the demonstration would be difficult. Then he reached into his desk drawer. He placed a small piece of paper on the desk between them. On it, in his handwriting, 2 lines. "The remains of the day, Kazuo Ishiguro, pages 47 to 48. Frances looked at the paper. She knew immediately which shelf. 3rd from the left, 2nd row from the top, literature I through K. She had shelved it herself, had read it herself, had sat across from Dorothy while Dorothy read the passage aloud, that she always read aloud when she wanted to say something she wasn't ready to say directly. She said, "What's on pages 47 and 48? Philip said, "I don't know." Dorothy asked me not to look. She said she left something there for you to find when you were ready. She said you'd know what to do with it." Frances picked up the piece of paper. She folded it once. She put it in her jacket pocket. She would go to the barn after this. She knew exactly where the book was. She had put it there herself. The fog had come down from the Blue Ridge overnight and was still sitting in the valley when Frances arrived at the courthouse. It was the specific fog of December in the North Carolina mountains, not dramatic, not obscuring, just present a softening of edges, that made the courthouse and the parking lot and the bare trees along the street look like a photograph taken slightly out of focus. She had been to this building once before years ago, for something unrelated, and had found it then as she found it now, a place that had been conducting its serious business for so long that the seriousness had become part of the architecture. Philip was already inside. He had the 6 catalog notebooks in a canvas bag, which he placed on the defense table when they sat down. He did not open them. He set them in a row along the edge of the table and left them there. Frances looked at them. 6 notebooks, 8 years, 2 handwritings alternating through 4,000 entries, the record of every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. Every book read every note made in the margins, every conversation that had happened in the language of the books rather than in the language of conversation. She had helped build that record. She had not known while building it that it was also a document. Niles and Janet were at the plaintiff's table with their 2 attorneys, Craig Holst on the left, a younger associate beside him. 3 stacks of folders, the preparation of people who had been building a case for 3 weeks and had confidence in what they had built. Niles was in a dark suit. He had the composed expression of a man who had decided how the day would go and was now waiting for it to go that way. Janet was beside him. She had the expression of a woman who had been telling herself a story about the purpose of this proceeding and was holding the story carefully. Neither of them looked at Frances when she sat down. Judge Catherine Prewitt came in at 9. She was 58, had been on the Buncombe County Superior Court bench for 14 years, and had the economy of movement of a person who had been making consequential decisions in this room long enough to have stopped finding the weight of them remarkable. She sat. She looked at the room. She said good morning. Craig Holst opened for the plaintiff. He was thorough. He established the timeline, Dorothy's age, her health history, in the final years the pattern of Frances's increasing presence in her life, the relative absence of Niles and Janet due to geography and their own family and professional obligations. He framed this absence as normal and the presence as opportunistic. He used the word isolation 3 times in the first 10 minutes. He said the evidence will show that Frances Aldridge positioned herself as the primary emotional support for an elderly, increasingly isolated woman, and used that position to influence a property transfer that Dorothy Calder would not have made under circumstances free from that influence. Philip's opening was 4 minutes. He said Dorothy Calder was a retired librarian who spent 15 years building a private library of 4,000 books. The evidence will show that she knew exactly what she was doing when she signed this deed, that she had arranged an independent neuropsychological evaluation 4 weeks before signing, and that she left a record in her own handwriting of exactly why she made this decision. He put his hand briefly on the catalog notebooks. He did not open them. Holst called Frances to the stand at 9:10. She walked to the stand the way she walked everywhere, without hurry, without the performance of composure, simply moving from one place to another, with the particular quality of a person who has been through enough of life's difficult weather to have stopped needing to demonstrate that she could handle it. Holst started with the small questions. When had she met Dorothy? How had they come to spend time together? What was the nature of their relationship? She answered each one in the direct, economical way she answered things, the minimum words needed to be accurate, no elaboration. Then he shifted. He said, Mrs. Aldridge, can you explain why a 79-year-old woman would leave property valued at $1.4 million to a friend rather than her own children? Frances said, I can't explain Dorothy's decisions. I can speak to 8 years of our time together. Holst said, then speak to it. What did you do for Dorothy Calder in those 8 years? Frances did not answer immediately. She looked at the 6 notebooks on Philip's table. She looked back at Holst. She said, we read books. We cataloged books. We drank tea. We sat quietly when there was nothing to say, and neither of us felt the need to fill it. Holst was preparing to redirect. She could see the setup in his posture, the slight forward lean of a man about to reframe, but something stopped him. Not Philip's objection, not the judge's intervention. The judge was looking at Francis, not with the evaluative attention of a jurist assessing testimony, with something quieter and more specific, the look of a person who has heard something that has landed differently from the testimony that preceded it, and is taking a moment with it before the proceeding continues. Holst found his footing. He said, "Mrs. Aldridge, in those 8 years, did you ever suggest to Dorothy that her children were undeserving of her estate?" Francis said no. He said, "Did you ever discuss her estate with her?" She said no. He said, "Did you ever discuss Niles and Janet with her?" Francis said, "I never spoke with Dorothy about Niles and Janet." Holst said, "Why not?" Francis said, "Because Dorothy didn't speak about them with me. She spoke about books." The room was quiet for a moment. Holst looked at his notes. He was good at what he did, had recovered from unexpected moments in the courtrooms before, and had developed the professional resilience to find the next angle quickly. He found it. He said, "Mrs. Aldridge, isn't it true that by occupying Dorothy's time on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons for 8 years, you effectively reduced the time and opportunity for her children to maintain a meaningful relationship with her?" Francis looked at him. She said Dorothy had the same Tuesday and Thursday afternoons for 8 years. She could have used them differently if she wanted to. He said, "But she didn't, because you were there." Francis said, "I was there because she asked me to come. After the first year, she had a key made for me. She told me to come, even if she wasn't back from the doctor yet, and get started on the shelving." "That's not occupation, Mr. Holst. That's an invitation." Holst sat down. He said no further questions at this time. Philip stood. He said, "Mrs. Aldridge, in 8 years of Tuesday and Thursday afternoons in that barn, did you ever see Niles Calder there?" Francis said, "Once." He stood in the doorway for about 2 minutes. He didn't come in. Philip said, "Did you ever see Janet Calder Vogt in the barn?" Francis said no. Philip said, "Thank you. Nothing further." He sat down. He placed his hand on the top catalog notebook. He still did not open it. Not yet. The notebooks were not for this moment. They were for the moment after this one, when the court had seen what the testimony showed and was ready to see what the record confirmed. Philip stood. He did not go to the podium immediately. He went to the defense table, first picked up the canvas bag, and carried it to the front of the courtroom with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has decided exactly what he is going to do and is not going to be rushed about doing it. He set the bag on the edge of the clerk's table. He removed the first catalog notebook. He placed it on the podium and opened it. He said, "Your Honor, I'd like to submit these 6 notebooks as evidence and ask the court to examine them." Holst was on his feet. He said, "Objection. The relevance of personal notebooks to..." Philip said, "These are the catalog records of Dorothy Calder's private library. They contain 4,000 entries spanning 8 years each entry, noting the book title, the date it was read or cataloged, and the initials of the person who made the notation. They are directly relevant to the question of who had a substantive relationship with Dorothy Calder and who did not." The judge looked at the notebook. She said, "I'll allow it. Continue." Philip opened the first notebook to a page in the middle. He said, "I'm going to read 3 entries at random. Not selected entries. I'm going to ask the court reporter to call a page number." The court reporter looked up. The judge nodded. She said, "Page 94. Philip turned to page 94. He read entry 847, January 14th, the hours Michael Cunningham, notation by F.A., the Stevens section, the cost of that much self-suppression, discussed Tuesday. He said, "F.A. Francis Aldridge, January 14th, a Tuesday." He turned pages. He read entry 1203, March 8th, housekeeping Marilyn Robinson, notation by D.C., asked Francis if she thought Ruth's leaving was freedom or another kind of drowning. We didn't agree. Good. He said D.C. Dorothy Calder, March 8th, a Thursday. He turned pages again. He said entry 2, 891, October 23rd, Gilead Marilyn Robinson, notation by Effa. Dorothy read the letter to the Sun section aloud. Neither of us spoke for several minutes after, stayed until dark. He closed the notebook. He looked at the plaintiff's table. He said, "Mr. Calder, can you tell the court which books Dorothy read in the last year of her life?" The room was very still. Niles looked at Holst. Holst said, "Objection. This witness hasn't been recalled to the stand." The judge said, "I'll allow the question. Mr. Calder, you may answer from where you're seated." Niles looked at the catalog notebook on the podium. He said, She read a lot. She always had books around." Philip said, "Can you name one book she was reading in the last year of her life?" Niles said nothing. The silence was not long. It was long enough. Philip said, "Mr. Calder, how many books does the barn behind the Weaverville house contain?" Niles looked at Holst. Holst did not look back. Niles said, "I'm not sure exactly. Several hundred, I'd imagine." Philip reached into the canvas bag. He removed the 6th notebook, the last one, the most recent, its cover slightly newer than the others, the binding less worn. He opened it to the final page. He said the barn contains 4,000 books, catalogued over 8 years. The last entry in this catalog is dated February 14th. He set the notebook on the clerk's desk and turned it so the judge could read it. He said February 14th, 9 days before Dorothy Calder died. The entry is in Frances Aldridge's handwriting. It catalogs a copy of Elizabeth Bishop's complete poems, notes the condition of the spine, and includes a reading observation in Dorothy's hand, in the margin, "Worth rereading at every age, what you notice changes." He paused. He said that is the last entry in 8 years of records. Dorothy Calder made a notation in the margin of a book 9 days before she died. He let that sit. He reached into his briefcase. He produced a medical document, the Neuropsychological Evaluation Formal Letterhead, dated 4 weeks before Dorothy had signed the deed. He said Dorothy Calder independently scheduled a neuropsychological evaluation with Dr. Renata Marsh, a specialist in geriatric cognitive assessment with no prior connection to Dorothy's medical team. She scheduled it herself, did not inform her children, and brought the completed evaluation to Philip Ware's office when she came to sign the deed. He submitted the document to the clerk. He said Dr. Marsh's summary states patient demonstrates full cognitive clarity, clear awareness of the nature and extent of her assets, clear identification of the intended beneficiary, and clear comprehension of the legal and practical consequences of her decision. No significant cognitive impairment affecting legal decision-making capacity was identified. He returned to the defense table. He said, "Your Honor, the plaintiff has argued that Dorothy Calder did not understand what she was signing. The medical record shows she arranged an independent assessment specifically to demonstrate that she did. The plaintiff has argued that Frances Aldridge isolated Dorothy from her family. The catalog record shows that Dorothy spent 8 years building a document in her own handwriting that described exactly who was present in her intellectual and emotional life." He placed his hand on the 6 notebooks. He said Mr. Calder was unable to name a single book his mother read in the last year of her life. He estimated the barn contains several hundred books. It contains 4,000. The last entry in Dorothy Calder's personal library catalog, made 9 days before her death, is in Frances Aldridge's handwriting. He sat down. The room was quiet. Judge Prewitt looked at the 6 notebooks on the defense table. She looked at the neuropsychological evaluation on the clerk's desk. She looked at the final catalog entry. She said in the measured tone of someone who has reached a conclusion and is confirming it rather than announcing it, "Mr. Holst, do you wish to call additional witnesses?" Holst looked at Niles. Niles was looking at the catalog notebook, at the 6th one still open on the clerk's desk, at the final entry in Frances's handwriting, at the 9 days between February 14th and the day his mother died. He said, "We need to reconsider our position." The judge said, "We'll take a 30-minute recess." She stood and walked out. The room exhaled. Frances was looking at the notebooks, at the 6 of them in their row on the defense table. The record of 8 years of Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, the evidence of a relationship written in 2 handwritings across 4,000 entries, the document Dorothy had built, without knowing she was building evidence, but with the specific care of someone who believed that attention deserved to be recorded. Dorothy had cataloged everything. Dorothy had always cataloged everything. That was who she was. And in the end, the catalog had said what needed to be said better than any argument could have. The recess lasted 20 minutes. When the court reconvened, the room had the specific quality of a room in which something has already been decided and is waiting for the formalities to confirm it. Holst was at the plaintiff's table with the composed expression of a man revising his position. Niles was looking at the table. Janet had her hands in her lap. Philip stood. He said, "Your Honor, before we proceed, Dorothy Calder left a handwritten addendum with the deed. Not a legal clause, she described it as her reasons. I'd like to read it into the record." Holst said, "Objection. A personal statement doesn't constitute—" The judge said, "I'll hear it. Proceed." Philip reached into his briefcase. He removed a single page, the same quality of paper Dorothy had used for correspondence. Her entire adult life, cream-colored the handwriting, the specific, deliberate script of a woman who had spent her professional life surrounded by the written word and believed that how you wrote something communicated as much as what you wrote. He held it. He read, I leave the house and the barn to Frances, not because my children are undeserving, but because for 8 years Frances came here every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. No one asked her to come. No one paid her to come. And she never once asked me what the barn was worth. That is the only reason I need." Philip folded the page. He placed it on the clerk's desk. He returned to his chair and sat down. The room was quiet in the complete way, not the ordinary quiet of a proceeding between moments, but the specific stillness of a room in which something has been said that has settled into the air and is simply present now, requiring nothing further. Judge Prewitt had not written anything while Philip read. She was looking at the page on the clerk's desk. Then she looked at Frances. Frances was sitting with her hands folded on the table in front of her, the same posture she had held throughout the morning, the posture of a woman who had come into this room without anything to prove, and was leaving with the same quality of presence she had brought in. She was looking at the page on the clerk's desk, reading it or perhaps rereading it, absorbing the specific language of a woman she had spent 8 years sitting with in a barn in Weaverville, North Carolina, who had apparently spent some portion of those years watching her and had found in the watching a reason. The judge looked at Niles. Niles was looking straight ahead, not at the judge, not at Frances, not at the page. At the middle distance, the specific focal point of a person who is processing something in public that they would prefer to process privately and has chosen the only available option, which is to hold very still and direct their attention at nothing in particular. Janet was looking at the table. She had been composed throughout the morning, the composed expression of a woman who had prepared herself for this proceeding and was managing it. She was not managing it now. She was simply looking at the table, not crying, not performing anything, just sitting with what she had heard in the specific silence of someone who has understood something they had not understood before and is not yet sure what to do with the understanding. In the gallery, B. Sutton opened her eyes. She had closed them when Philip began to read, not from distress, not from emotion she needed to contain, but from the specific inward attention of a person receiving something they already know and want to receive fully. She had heard Dorothy read this statement twice, once to test the words, once because Dorothy had said she liked the way it sounded out loud. B had said, "Dorothy, did you write it right?" Dorothy had said, "B, I wrote exactly what needed to be written." B had agreed then. She agreed now, sitting in the gallery of the Buncombe County Superior Court, watching the room absorb a retired librarian's plain, complete, entirely sufficient explanation of why she had done what she had done. Holst requested a recess to confer with his clients. The judge granted it. Niles and Janet went into a conference room with their attorneys. The door closed. Frances and Philip sat at the defense table. Philip poured water from the carafe on the table and set a glass in front of Frances and one in front of himself, and they sat without speaking in the way of two people who have done what they came to do and are waiting for the rest of the proceeding to catch up. B came from the gallery and sat in the empty chair beside Frances. She did not say anything. She put her hand over Frances's on the table and left it there. 18 minutes. Then the conference room door opened, and Holst and the associate and Niles and Janet came back in and took their places. Holst said, "Your Honor, the plaintiffs are withdrawing the petition." He did not explain further. There was nothing to explain further. Dorothy Calder had explained it. The judge said the petition is withdrawn. The beneficiary deed executed by Dorothy Calder on March 7th stands as recorded. The property transfers to Frances Aldridge as specified. She looked at Niles. She looked at Janet. She looked at the page on the clerk's desk, the cream-colored page in Dorothy's handwriting, the page that was now part of the permanent record of Buncombe County Superior Court and would remain there after everyone in this room was gone. She said quietly in the register of a statement not intended for the record but entering it anyway. In 22 years I have presided over estate disputes. I rarely read a reason as simple as that one, or as accurate. She stood. She closed the session. She walked out. Frances sat for a moment after the room began to empty. Bee's hand was still on hers. She was thinking about Dorothy, about the February afternoon she had described to Philip, the afternoon Dorothy had written this page, and read it and decided it was right and called him to say she was done. She was thinking about Dorothy writing those words at her desk with the lamp on, crossing out 2 words and rewriting them, reading it a second time, nodding to herself in the specific way she nodded when something was correct. She had not asked what the barn was worth. She had never thought to ask. It was a barn with 4,000 books and 2 chairs, and the light coming in at different angles depending on the time of day. And Dorothy had been there, and she had been there, and that had been the entirety of what it needed to be. Dorothy had known that. Dorothy had written it down. 6 weeks after the ruling, Frances came back to the barn on a Tuesday morning. Not because she had decided to come, because it was Tuesday, and she did not know how not to come, had not known for 8 years, had come every Tuesday and Thursday through rain and through the particular ice storms that came to the Blue Ridge in February, and through the weeks after her mother died, and through the weeks after her divorce when she had first come to Weaverville and Dorothy had handed her a blank notebook and said, "I need someone to help me catalog books. Would you like to try?" She stood in the doorway for a moment. The barn was the same. The 2 chairs by the window, the morning light on the east-facing shelves, the catalog notebooks on the small desk in the corner, the particular smell of old paper and cedar, and the faint sweetness of the dried flowers Dorothy had kept in a jar on the windowsill for as long as Frances had been coming here. She stepped inside. She knew which shelf without looking at the note Philip had given her. 3rd from the left 2nd row from the top literature I through K. She had shelved. The remains of the day herself had catalogued it in year 3, had written her own notation in the margin of page 196, had discussed it with Dorothy on a Thursday afternoon in November, when the light was going early and they had stayed past dark without meaning to. She found it by the spine. She pulled it from the shelf. The Post-it note was on the front cover in Dorothy's handwriting, the blue ink Dorothy always used, the specific, deliberate script of a woman who had spent her professional life surrounded by words and believed that how you wrote them mattered. "Frances, when you're ready." She carried the book to her chair. She sat down. She opened it to page 47. The letter fell into her lap. 2 pages folded, once the same blue ink, the same handwriting. She unfolded them and held them in both hands and looked at the first line for a moment before she began to read. Dorothy had not explained the deed. She had not addressed the legal proceedings, had not anticipated them. Specifically, had simply written what she wanted to say to Frances in the language she used for things that mattered, direct, specific, with the precision of a woman who had spent 30 years as a librarian and understood that the right word was a form of respect. She had written about a specific afternoon, the Tuesday in the 5th year winter, the light going by 3 o'clock. Frances had arrived with a small apple cake, not announced, not explained, simply produced from the bag she had been carrying. She had set it on the side table between the chairs and had gone directly to the shelving cart and begun working because that was what she did when she arrived, and because the cake did not require acknowledgement, had not been brought for acknowledgement. Dorothy had eaten it, all of it in small pieces over the course of the afternoon while Frances worked through the shelving, and they talked about the books and didn't talk about them the ordinary rhythm of a Tuesday, that was not different from any other Tuesday, except that it was. Dorothy had not said thank you. Not because she was not grateful. Frances understood this reading the letter, in the way you understand things about a person you have spent 8 years sitting beside, but because Dorothy expressed things differently. Because gratitude in Dorothy's vocabulary was not a thing you said once in the moment, but a thing you carried and expressed in the accumulation of actions over time. In the letter, Dorothy wrote, "I ate the whole cake. It was the first time in 3 months I had finished anything. You didn't know. That's exactly the reason." Frances read the letter to the end. She folded it along its original crease. She placed it back between pages 47 and 48, which was where Dorothy had put it and where it belonged. She held the closed book in her lap. She looked at Dorothy's chair. The wool blanket was still folded over the arm in the exact way Dorothy had folded it. The specific fold of a person who had been folding blankets in this particular way for years. The fold that was not neat in any performed sense, but was right in the way of habits that have been practiced long enough to become themselves. Frances had not touched it in 6 weeks. She had not been ready to touch it. She was ready now. She reached over and put her hand on the blanket. She felt the texture of it, the specific roughness of old wool, the warmth it retained even in the cool of the barn in the morning. Then she did something she had not done in 6 weeks of coming back to this barn. She moved her chair, not far, 6 inches perhaps, bringing it closer to Dorothy's chair, returning it to the position it had naturally occupied over 8 years of Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. The position it drifted from whenever she moved it away from the window for better light, and drifted back to whenever she was simply sitting. Its right position, the position it had been in every afternoon for 8 years. She sat down. The morning light came through the east window at the angle it came in at this hour, finding the spines of the books on the shelves in the specific way it found them in the morning, different from how it found them in the afternoon. The books different objects in different light, the way everything was different depending on when you looked at it. 4,000 books. 6 notebooks. 8 years! Dorothy had written, "I didn't leave the barn to you because you deserved it. I left it because no one else would keep sitting in that chair, and these 4,000 books need someone to sit beside them." Frances sat beside them. The chair was in its right place. The morning was doing what mornings did. It was Tuesday. She was here. The first Tuesday afternoon of spring came with the particular light of the Blue Ridge in April, not the thin tentative light of early March, but something fuller, the light that had decided what it was going to be and was being it without hesitation. Frances unlocked the barn at 2 o'clock. She went to the window first, the one that faced the mountains, the one Dorothy had chosen for the chairs, because it had the best angle for reading in the late afternoon, and because the Blue Ridge was visible from it in a way that Dorothy had said was like having company that didn't require anything from you. The curtain Dorothy had made for this window, the heavy linen the color of oatmeal stitched by hand over 2 winter afternoons, had been drawn since October. Frances reached up and pulled it back. The light came in the way light comes in when it has been waiting, a wide bar of it warm, falling across the floorboards in the specific gold of an April afternoon, finding the dust motes in the air and the spines of the books on the east-facing shelves and the 2 chairs and the small table between them. Frances stood in it for a moment. Then she went to make the tea. The kettle was on the small shelf where Dorothy had always kept it beside the tin of the blend they had been drinking for 8 years, a specific Darjeeling from a shop in Asheville that Dorothy had discovered in the 2nd year and that had become the barn's tea in the way that some things become simply what a place uses without anyone deciding it. She made 2 cups. She carried them to the table between the chairs. She placed 1 cup on the left side, her table, the side where she had been setting her tea for 8 years. She placed the other cup on the right side on the small table beside Dorothy's chair, where Dorothy's tea had always gone. She was not confused about what she was doing. She was not pretending. She placed the cup there because it was where it had always gone, and because she did not want to stop placing it there, because stopping would be a decision to make the chair into an absence rather than a presence, and she had not made that decision and did not intend to. The chair was there, the blanket was folded over the arm, the cup was on the table. She sat down in her own chair. She reached into her bag and took out the new notebook. It was the same kind Dorothy had always used, the plain composition notebook, the cardboard cover, the narrow ruled lines meant for serious work rather than casual notes. She had bought 3 of them at the hardware store on Main Street, which was where Dorothy had always bought them, which Bea had told her, and which Frances had confirmed by looking at the back cover of the first catalog notebook, where Dorothy had written the store name and the item number in pencil. She opened it to the first page. The page was blank. The specific blankness of a first page in a new notebook, white expectant, not yet committed to anything. She uncapped her pen. She wrote the date. She wrote the title of the book she had been reading. She wrote her own notation in her own hand in the catalog's established format, the format Dorothy had designed in the first month, and that Frances had learned and kept for 8 years. The catalog had an entry 4001 now. It was in Frances's handwriting only. She thought about Niles and Janet, not with the particular weight that had accompanied the thought in the months of the legal proceedings, the heavy, complicated weight of being argued about, of having your life characterized as something it was not. That weight had moved through her and was gone. What remained when she thought about them now was something lighter and more melancholy, the specific sadness of watching a person miss something that was right in front of them. They had had 8 years of Tuesday and Thursday afternoons available to them. They had had a barn full of 4,000 books and their mother's handwriting in the margins of all of them. Dorothy had not hidden the barn. She had not concealed the catalog. She had not prevented anyone from coming in and sitting down and picking up a book. She had simply lived her life in this barn on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and anyone who wanted to know what that life contained had only to walk through the door and ask. No one had walked through the door and asked. Frances had walked through the door because Dorothy had handed her a notebook and said, "I need someone to help me catalog books. Would you like to try?" That was all it had taken. That was all it had ever taken. Outside the window, the Blue Ridge was doing what it did in April, going the particular blue-green of the mountains in spring, the color returning to them after the gray of winter, the ridgeline clear against the sky in the specific way of a clear day after a season of weather. Frances held her tea. The catalog was open on her lap, the first entry written in her hand. The chair beside her was in its place. The blanket was on the arm. The second cup of tea was on the table, going warm and then cool the way tea does when no one is drinking it, which was its own kind of presence. 4,000 books on the shelves behind her. The catalog notebooks, all 7 of them, now 6 in Dorothy's blue ink and hers, combined one just begun in hers alone, on the small desk in the corner. She said quietly to the barn, not to Dorothy, not to anyone who was not there, just to the place itself, to the shelves and the light and the April afternoon coming through the window. 4001? The barn was quiet. The mountains were blue-green and clear. The books were where they had always been. And on the first Tuesday afternoon of spring, Frances Aldridge was in her chair in the barn on Weaverville Road with her tea and her catalog, and the light coming in through the window. Dorothy had made a curtain for doing what she had been doing for 8 years. She was here. Dorothy had known she would be. That was exactly the reason.